He became a global symbol of freedom. But some believe he helped build something very different. His face is everywhere, on shirts, posters, protests. A revolutionary, a hero, a legend. But the deeper you look, the more the story begins to fracture. Because behind the iconic image, there are documents, testimonies, and decisions that raise uncomfortable questions. Questions about power, about violence, and about what freedom really meant. And by the end of this video, you'll have to decide for yourself what Che Guevara actually stood for. Ernesto Che Guevara wasn't born a revolutionary. He was a medical student, curious, observant, someone who believed the world could be understood if you were willing to see it up close. In his early 20s, he traveled across Latin America. What he saw changed him. Poverty, inequality, entire communities forgotten. And slowly, an idea began to take shape. Not reform, revolution. It wasn't long before he met someone who shared that vision. Fidel Castro. Together, they helped lead a movement that would overthrow the Cuban government in 1959. And for a moment, it felt like history had changed direction. But revolutions don't end when power is taken. That's usually when they begin. The Cuban Revolution didn't happen overnight. It was the result of years of conflict, planning, and shifting alliances. In 1952, Fulgencio Batista seized power in Cuba through a military coup. His government was quickly supported by sectors of the military, business elites, and maintained close ties with the United States. But inside the country, dissatisfaction was growing. In 1953, a young lawyer named Fidel Castro led an attack on the Moncada barracks in Santiago de Cuba. The attack failed, many were killed, and Castro was arrested. But that moment would later be seen as the beginning of the revolution. After being released from prison in 1955, Castro went into exile in Mexico, and it was there that he met Ernesto Che Guevara. In 1956, they returned to Cuba aboard a small boat called the Granma, along with a group of around 80 revolutionaries. Most of them didn't survive the initial landing, but a small group escaped into the Sierra Maestra Mountains. And from there, they began a guerrilla war. Over the next 2 years, they gained support from peasants, students, and segments of the Cuban population disillusioned with Batista. By late 1958, the regime was weakening. On January 1st, 1959, Batista fled the country, and the revolutionaries took control of Cuba. But taking power was only the beginning of what would come next. After the revolution, Che Guevara took on positions of power, including control over a place called La Cabaña, a fortress turned into a prison. People accused of being enemies of the revolution were brought there. Trials were conducted, and in many cases, the outcomes were final. Supporters say it was necessary, that the revolution needed to defend itself. But critics describe something else entirely. Rapid trials, limited defense, irreversible decisions. The exact numbers are still debated. But one thing isn't. Che Guevara was at the center of it. But the story doesn't stop there, because the revolution wasn't just about power, it was about control. In the years that followed, the Cuban government began targeting groups considered undesirable, political opponents, religious figures, and eventually, others who didn't fit the ideal, including homosexuals. Some link this environment directly to the early revolutionary ideology. Others argue it came later, but the result wasn't equal for everyone. The revolution promised equality, stability, a new beginning, but reality is harder to build than ideas. Over time, Cuba faced serious economic challenges, food shortages, rationing, daily struggles. Some blame external pressure, others blame the system itself. But for millions of people, the promise didn't match the outcome. And that raises a difficult question. If the revolution was meant to liberate people, why were so many trying to leave? After Cuba, Che Guevara believed the revolution could not remain confined to one island. He wanted to export it, to turn Cuba into the beginning, not the destination. In 1965, he disappeared from public view in Cuba. Soon after, he traveled secretly to the Congo in Central Africa. At the time, the region was in turmoil after the assassination of Patrice Lumumba, and different factions were fighting for power. Che arrived there to support leftist rebel forces opposing the Congolese government and its foreign-backed allies. His goal was to help build another guerrilla revolution. But from the beginning, the mission was failing. The fighters were disorganized. Discipline was weak. Coordination was poor. Che later became deeply frustrated with the lack of structure and commitment among the forces he was trying to support. The terrain was difficult, the politics were unstable, and the revolutionary model that had worked in Cuba simply did not translate. By the end of 1965, the Congo mission had collapsed. Che left Africa in defeat, but he did not abandon the idea. Instead, he turned to South America. In 1966, under a false identity, he secretly traveled to Bolivia. The plan was to ignite a continental revolution from the heart of the region. Bolivia, in his view, could become the spark. But once again, reality was different. Bolivia was not Cuba. The terrain was harsh, local support was limited, communication with allies was fragile. The Bolivian Communist Party did not fully align with the operation, and the guerrilla force became increasingly isolated. By 1967, the situation had deteriorated rapidly. The Bolivian army, trained and assisted by the CYA, intensified its pursuit. One of the key figures involved in tracking the guerrillas was Felix Rodriguez, a CIA-linked Cuban exile working with Bolivian forces. On October 8, 1967, near the Quebrada del Uro, close to the village of La Higuera, Che Guevara was captured after combat with the Bolivian army. He had been wounded, he was exhausted, and he could no longer escape. Outnumbered and cut off from much of his remaining group, he was taken prisoner. That night, he was held in a small schoolhouse in La Higuera. The next day, October 9th, 1967, the order was given, and Che Guevara was executed. By then, the man who had helped win a revolution in Cuba had already failed to reproduce it in Africa, and failed again in South America. And that changes the way his final chapter is understood. But that wasn't the end of his story. It was the beginning of something else. Because in death, Che Guevara became a symbol, a global icon, a face that means different things to different people. For some, a hero. For others, something far more complicated. And maybe that's the real story. Not who he was, but why. After all this time, we still can't agree. Because this isn't the only story history simplified. And the next one might be even harder to ignore. Thanks for watching Curiosity Dose. The world is full of mysteries, hidden discoveries, and unbelievable truths waiting to be uncovered. If you love curiosity, knowledge, and the unexplained, you're in the right place. Stay curious, and don't miss your next Curiosity Dose.